So, I've heard that you want someone dead. Why are you shocked? I've got eyes and ears everywhere, but don't feel too much shame, because you see, while you shouldn't be feeling that way, it's not surprising. The desire is somewhat universal. Because, as long as there are people roaming this earth, there is going to be the perennial wish to see someone that you are not particularly fond of fall victim to a non-voluntary census omission. Going all the way back to the Bible, when Cain murked his brother because he got his stretch goal donation BTFO'd in the Old Testament subathon. But who do you call for such a task? What kind of cold-hearted creature do you casually ring up to Iceman? Well, you would call Richard Kuklinski the Iceman. Please leave a like and a comment on this video because it really helps me in the algorithm. Hey Big Cheese, I bet you're excited for today's video, eh? Well, I would like a moment of your time, please, for a certain special someone. You know him, I love him, and you will too. It is in fact your boy, Raid Shadow Legends. That's right, lads, Raid are back and they're better than ever, so let's have a gander at what they've been cooking. What time is it? It's time to kick butt. That's the time it is.
In this world, I've died 1,000 deaths.
Oh no, she's fell right down
but
the
each
rabbit hole.
one
That's a shame.
made me stronger.
I mean, I've read the book. The book wasn't
and
like
when
this.
the time was right,
Yeah, the book definitely
I
wasn't.
sacrificed the old Alice, so I could be.
Alice is mad. Alice is upset
reborn.
now. Can everybody tell that I'm great at reactions, which is why I don't do it.
As for my captor,
That's the Mad Hatter,
poor thing.
I think.
Imagine
I think that's
building
supposed to be the queen,
perfect
but she's like a
cage,
robot
only to
made.
find
I mean,
yourself
that's
locked in it.
probably going to end up in the 34,
me.
but okay.
If
Is that
I'm
meant to be the
bound
cat?
To stay here until the end of time.
None of this is lore accurate. I mean, it's
better
cool.
make myself
It's cool that she
comfortable.
just this is a children's story. She just beheaded someone. I mean, I'd still hit it. That's right, at this very moment in time, Raid has a unique global event known as Alice's Adventure going on, and if you dare go down the rabbit hole by logging in at any point before March 26th, you can get access to multiple login rewards, including legendary champion Alice the Wanderer for free on day 7, alongside a 2-star perfect soul for her on day 14. Alice the Wanderer isn't the only champion that is up for grabs during this event, however, as 4 other champions are ripe for the taking, including the Cheshire Cat, the Mad Hatter, Knave of Hearts, and her liege, the Queen of Hearts, but in order to get her, you would have to best her in combat. Oh, did that pique your interest? Well, my dear little sugar plum, Raid Shadow Legends has never been more approachable, as by scanning the QR code on the screen or clicking the link in the description box down below, and you can get a free starter pack containing a swathe of great goodies, including Epic Champion Drake. But it doesn't end there. Oh no, for if you make it to level 15, you will get another pack of goods that include Epic Champion Knight Errant. So, to get in on all of this action, you need to once again scan the QR code on the screen or click the link in the description box down below for the Drake and Errant pack. Additionally, you can also use code Monkey King to get yet another legendary champion in the form of Sun Wukong for free. Though that code will only work until February 28th, so you better be quick. So again, scan the QR code on the screen or click the link in the description box down below and come and join me in raiding the Shadow legendarily with my clan, the Dank Brigade. Now, back to the video. Karwacz in Polish-infested Poland. We see the departure of an immigrant-to-be by the name of Stanislaw Kuklinski. He's not particularly important, save for the fact that he emigrated to New Jersey to work as a brakeman. He ended up meeting a Catholic woman who pretended to be Irish and worked as a meat packer. After deciding that Anna, as she was known, was actually worth it, he ended up marrying her, and then partook in the newlywed Catholic tradition of immediately pumping out a lot of children, including young Master Richard Leonard Kuklinski on April the 11th, 1935, introducing him as the second child of 4 in the McMongrel-Kuklinski tribe. The Kuklinskis were, of course, a rather traditional Catholic family, with Richard being made an altar boy at his local church alongside being enrolled at a grammar school. And because this family wasn't stereotypical enough, they decided to start following another Catholic tradition. Stanislaw was a deadbeat alcoholic who beat his wife and kids, being completely out of his litter's life except for when he stumbled home to ask for money or to give all the little shits a knuckle sandwich. As a matter of fact, he was so severe in his papal piety that he ended up actually killing young Richard's 7-year-old brother, Florian. That is extremely fucked up, and surely Stanislaw was sent away to rot in prison. Well, no, not quite, because for whatever fucking reason, the wife Anna actually helped Stanislaw in obscuring the death of the boy from the eyes of the law, claiming that he totally died from falling down the stairs and not because he was bonked over the soft part of his head with a high-velocity can of whoop-ass. No siree. And fun fact, despite this case of scumbag unity, Anna and Stanislaw were usually trying to kill each other, with Stanislaw trying to Rocky Balboa and beat his bitch wife to death, and with Anna attempting to actually stab Stanislaw in between sessions of her breaking broom handles from beating her kids with them, including little Richard. What an utterly delightful family and home environment. I wonder what the effects of this will be like on the malleable minds of Richard and co. Well, to the surprise of absolutely fucking no one, this had something of a debuff to the attitudes and prospects of the children. Discounting the obvious one that we are going to get into, there was also the example of Richard's brother, Joseph. Being a very, very naughty boy, he ended up getting arrested in the 1970s for raping a 12-year-old and then chucking her off of the roof of a 5-story building. I'm bringing this up because, first of all, Jesus fucking Christ, and second of all, it is a very good way to further highlight just how shit the Kuklinski clan was as a family. I mean, sure, I've already presented more than enough to show that, but still. So it is absolutely no shock then that young Richard was also at the receiving end of a lot of malarkey outside of the household, because the scrawny little kid was apparently a prime target for local street gangs who wanted to give little Richard a wedgie. But it turns out that when children go through puberty, they get a lot bigger in size. And little Richard became not so little Richard. By the time he was 16 years old, he was now big enough to actually put up something of a fight against his adolescent adversaries. Though not the biggest or the brawniest, he was still around 6'5". This harrowing height maugery was further bolstered when one realises that Richard was more than acclimated to violence through cold hard experience. Like a Kenshi character, he had been beaten so consistently and so harshly over the course of his entire life that not only was his pain tolerance extreme, but so was his capability for violence, as he demonstrated when he responded to said gangs that would bully him by cold approaching 6 of them with a steel pipe, and then proceeding to beat the absolute fuck out of every single one of them. According to interviews, Richard claimed that by this point, he had already killed, with his murderous cherry supposedly being popped at the age of 14. Now, I don't actually believe this, but we'll get into that later. Regardless of that, it was at around this point that the penny dropped for young Richard. If you aren't dishing out hurt, you're going to be receiving it. And by complete coincidence, he was really fucking good at dishing it out. And within the next few years, he would gain a reputation for being something of a bad hombre when it came to street fights, with a short temper and even shorter tolerance. Though, obviously compared to his later actions, this is somewhat tame. In time, Richard mustered the courage and resources to start afresh and get out of the family home smackdown. He would go on to become something of a petty criminal, partaking in street scraps and the occasional burgling sesh. It was during this time that he actually had his heart burgled by a fair maiden known as Linda, tying the knot with her and then having 2 children named Richard Jr. and David. Fun fact, during this time when he was just 18 years old, Richard claimed that he killed a man after witnessing said victim in a bar acting somewhat uncouth. After heading outside and seeing the man asleep inside of his car, Richard proceeded to supposedly firebomb the car with the man still inside, ensuring that the prick patron was well done. Now that seems like a little bit of an overreaction to a guy just being a prick in a bar. So, what actually caused this? Well, apparently the guy actually reminded Richard of his father. Regardless of possible conflagration, Richard decided to maintain family tradition and divorced his wife. Deciding to move on with great haste, Richard found himself another broad in one 19-year-old Barbara Predici, an accountant at the same trucking company that Richard worked at the time. Because, of course he did. After all, in America, truckers aren't uncouth and fat hicks that dominate a ham radio in between mid-work drinking sessions. They must be either serial killers, rapists, hitmen, or any combination of the 3. Anyways, eventually Dick realised that the life of Euro trucking was, as a matter of fact, not able to sustain the needs of a family. And as such, he found himself wandering into the mythical land of Manhattan, where he procured himself a job at a film lab. And for all of the Zoomers in the audience, that's a place that you went to develop film from your camera. And no, that's not just a trope in the detective films. They actually did it for real with the low-lit red light rooms and everything. Because we used to have physical photographs. Remember physical photographs? Regardless, it was at this film lab where Richard started his crime spree in selling bootleg Disney films and pornography. It was through this dastardly and outright degenerate market that he first came across and eventually became associates with some incredibly influential coomers. The Gambinos. Indeed, he became a goon for the Gambinos through selling bargain bin smut. Not exactly the most imposing of entrances into the career of a hitman. But anyway, Richard found himself a side hustle as an enforcer and debt collector for the gang, and due to his particular set of skills, he ended up becoming a natural. Intimidating, scaring, and beating the money out of those people who owed it to the family. And if they didn't pay, well, you know. And in a strange twist of irony, a lot of his customers were former clients of his. Men who wanted a cheeky wee VHS in the past ended up in debt, only to then get a knock on the door from the big brooding bastard that initially sold them this shameful media. Like George Malaband, a former client of Richard's that was set to meet up with him to purchase more product. Issue was, he owed some cash. And Richard came to the meet-up and then immediately shot George in the face. He then took the supposed 27 grand that George had on his person, then cut the coomer up and stuffed him into a barrel, leaving it in a chemical plant in Jersey. Moral of the story is, never goon. And wouldn't you know it, this little side hustle was rather lucrative. Richard was able to get himself a nice house in Dumont, New Jersey, and 3 new kids. 2 daughters, Kristen and Merrick, and a son by the name of Dwayne. But what about his other kids with his other wife, Davy and Richard Jr.? Well, as per Catholic tradition, Richard was seemingly out of their lives entirely. Presumably, they stayed with Linda, his ex-wife, and went on to have normal lives. Or well, as normal as you can have when your dad is not only absent, but also an incredibly famous hitman. And wouldn't you believe it, but Richard was actually quite the family man. Like, I'm not even being snarky or sarcastic, he really actually loved his kids and would have a self-described Jekyll and Hyde double life. Inside of you are 2 dicks. Slut. One is of respectable rich, a nondescript businessman and loving father who builds Lego sets with the kids and probably gets a little bit rowdy at Thanksgiving but would otherwise be a complete Ned Flanders. And the other would be Dastardly Dick, a cutthroat debt collector and hitman who had a reputation for being eerily cold, yet iconically brutish in etiquette. A complete monster in human form who would have a tendency to fly off the handle. It's important to note that Richard went right out of his way to maintain a Heisenberg-style relationship with his family. So far as he tried to ensure that they were kept completely in the dark about his true line of work, and as far away from danger as physically possible. The wife Barbara, of course, had her suspicions about Richard getting out of bed at 2 in the morning to go to a business meeting, but she had a rare virtue amongst women. She respected his privacy and didn't fucking stalk him. It wasn't until the 1980s that we get into some of the actually properly documented cases of Richard icing people. Case in point, the case of one Paul Hoffman. You see, Hoffman was a chemist by trade, and deciding that getting the required chemicals and compounds was too expensive and gay, he had something of an epiphany, an opportunity to hustle. He decided to try procuring such goods through more dubious means, mainly by buying stolen and or ill-gotten produce. The scheme was that he would buy said tainted goods and then resell them marked up in his pharmacy, which had the actual licenses and certificates of a real pharmacy, meaning he could hand-wave away any complaints or rumours of illegitimate street chems being sold. Because that's absurd, there's no possible way an actual licensed distributor and fully licensed pharmacy would willingly sell such things. So what the fuck does this have to do with Richard? Well, Hoffman wanted to use Kuklinski's burglar ring to create a steady inflow of Tagamet, which is used to treat stomach ulcers, to then resell it at a profit. A meeting was arranged between Kuklinski and Hoffman that was set to take place in a rented-out garage. As such, Paul Hoffman made his way to the meet site with 25 grand in his Polly pockets. And that was the last time he was ever seen alive. Yeah, it turns out that the second that Hoffman slapped the money down on the table, Richard revealed that this entire deal was a ruse. He then immediately stuck a gun under Hoffman's chin and pulled the trigger. The issue was that the shot didn't kill him. Richard tried remedying this by shooting him again, except the fucking gun jammed. Meaning that sure, Hoffman was tenuously still alive, but the bullet had penetrated through enough flesh that he was still on the cusp of dying rather painfully. Richard felt very bad about this inconvenience and, like a true professional, put Hoffman out of his misery by clubbing him to death with a tire iron and then stuffing his body into a barrel. Richard really likes stuffing bodies into barrels. The barrel was then left outside of a motel that Kuklinski frequented for his lunch. He would keep tabs on it, seeing it daily over the course of months. But what is very interesting to note is that one day, the barrel was gone. It had been moved by somebody other than Richard, but really, really weirdly, the barrel nor the body was ever recovered, and not even Richard knows what happened to it. Seriously, there was no police cordon, there was absolutely nothing, there was no investigation. The barrel with the body in it was just gone. Someone had took it. Like, that's... Someone literally found a barrel with a body in it and went, oh, finders keepers. So, by this point in time, surely the government knew of Richard and his activities. Well, sort of. They had their suspicions about Richard Kuklinski, the burglar, and were, by the early 80s, actively investigating his little ad hoc thieves guild. But as for Richard Kuklinski, the hitman, not so much. Because in fairness to the guy, he kept his illicit activities fractalized. He kept his eggs in many baskets. His bodies in many barrels, if you will. But eventually, as the years went on and Richard grew older, he also grew sloppier. Thus we arrive at the case of Gary Smith. December 1982 sees the arrest of one Percy House, a member of the Thieves Guild who very quickly folds under pressure and agrees to inform on the guild's activities for the police. This informing led to the creation of arrest warrants for one Daniel Deppner and our man of interest, Gary. Somehow, the guild was made aware of the warrants and Richard ordered the two fellas to lay low, being a bro and getting the two boys rooms at the York Motel in Jersey. Things got a little bit tense, however, when Gary started semi-regularly leaving the motel to go and see his daughter. Like some kind of loving parent or something. And that he was contemplating leaving the game and going straight. Presumably to be a good influence to said daughter. Kuklinski, however, found this rather suspicious. Deciding that Gary might get lifted and turned into an informer, Richard, alongside accomplice and certifiably not a Fed, Daniel Deppner, pounced. Well, not really. They tricked Gary by feeding him a burger laced with fucking cyanide. Which, by the way, Richard was semi-renowned for using. He fucking loved using cyanide. The shit made his job so much easier, and it made it so much more difficult to track. Regardless though, he fucked it, because the burger was underdosed and it wasn't killing Gary fast enough. So, to remedy this, Dick and Deppner strangled Gary with a lamp cord and then stuffed his body underneath the bed in the motel room. His corpse lay underneath the bed for around 5 days before it was found by the police. Now, here's the thing. The body was found in quite an advanced state of decomposition. 5 days is bad enough, but considering the fact that it was stuffed underneath a bed in a motel room meant that the heat and humidity sped along the decomposition to the point that getting a solid ID or cause of death would have been surprisingly difficult. But luckily for the police, the obvious strangulation marks around Gary's neck meant that they could squarely focus in on a murder investigation as opposed to, say, an overdose. Which is what they were initially investigating this as. Because, of course, junkies die and then stuff themselves underneath a bed for almost a week. Now, why the hell didn't Richard and Danny just move the body? Why keep the cadaver in the room where it's doubtlessly going to be found sooner rather than later? Well, it's quite simple. A woman, Danny Deppner's wife, also called Barbara, was actually tasked with getting a vehicle to the motel to transport the corpse away from the murder scene like a professional. However, because Barbara is a woman and they are fundamentally useless when it comes to follow-through or time management, especially in situations where you are probably facing the death penalty, she never actually showed up. Meaning, they had to try and shoddily dispose of him on site. Thus, resulting in Gary being stuffed underneath a mattress. And yes, throughout those 4 to 5 days of being stuffed underneath a mattress, people were sleeping on the exact same mattress that Gary was rotting underneath. Apparently, the only sign of his presence was an odd smell that gradually got stronger as the decomposition worsened. And he was only found after the manager got sick of getting complaints about this room and decided to finally go and check it, because God forbid a manager actually clean the fucking motel room. So now, with the dirty deed done and their tracks seemingly well covered, Dick and Dan could schmooze on by and chill the fuck out. Right? Well, after Gary got, Danny was moved to an apartment out near Bergenfield by Kuklinski that was conveniently owned by another Richard, this being Rich Patterson, whom by complete coincidence was the fiancé of Richard Kuklinski's daughter. So what? Why does that matter? But you've got to remember that Gary wasn't the only one with an arrest warrant on his head. Deppner was also wanted. Deppner thought he was safe, and Kuklinski ensured that he wasn't. Using a spare key that he of course had, he slinked into the apartment and killed 34-year-old Daniel Deppner not even 5 months after he helped him kill Gary. And how did he do it? Cyanide. Good old cyanide. But wait a second, how the fuck did he administer said cyanide? Deppner couldn't have possibly fallen for the old poison burger trick. Well, we'll get into that, but back on topic. Upon doing the deed and disposing of Deppner, Richard got a hold of Patterson and somehow speech 100'd him into helping him dispose of the body. Supposedly detailing how he totally just found Deppner like this, and he's totally like this because he had trouble with the mob, and they totally got him. And we should totally dump the body in an undisclosed place because it's not worth the hassle from the police. Trust me, Rich, I let you fuck my daughter, so you better not fuck me. Now help me load this prick into the back of the sedan. Deppner's body was found on May the 14th, 1983, partially eaten by a cyclist. That was very poor phrasing. The cyclist discovered him on the side of the road, wrapped up in green bin bags, and he was partially eaten due to the presence of vultures and other such scavengers picking at his yummy carcass. Upon being brought in for examination, the cadaver was found to have undigested food in his stomach and pinkish spots in his skin, which indicate symptoms of cyanide poisoning. However, wouldn't you know it, there were no visible injuries barring strangulation marks on his neck. Just like last time. I'm being completely fucking serious, by the way. He somehow managed to underdose the target again and had to once again strangle the fucking guy to actually kill him. So that's yet another associate of Richard Kuklinski's who has ended up dead in a similar manner. What are the chances of that? Well, the police found this to be most suspect, compounding the already bountiful case against Richard the thief. But around the same time as Deppner's death, another ghost of Richard's past makes its debut into the investigation. Louis Masg. You know the script. On July the 1st, 1981, Richard brokers a business agreement with 50-year-old Louis Masg over a large quantity of video cassettes. Masg shows up to Richard's lot with $95,000 in cash, and after entering the building, completely disappears. And it turns out that Richard iced him via snub nose to the back at point blank range. You know, the reliable way. None of this Walter White cyanide pish. But what's of interest is that Masg's body was not discovered until 2 years later, wrapped in multiple green bin bags by the side of the road, just like Deppner. However, what was of interest was the fact that the body was relatively fresh, 2 years after he gets shot. Yeah, Richard iced Masg and then iced him. As in, he literally stuck him in an industrial freezer for a couple of years and only just thawed him out to dump his corpse on the side of the road near Orangetown, Rockland County, to bamboozle the cops. The only issue was the idiot didn't thaw him out enough. He still had ice crystals in his blood when the coroner went in for a gander. So it didn't take long for them to realise that this guy was well past his sell-by date. And in case you were wondering, yes, the Louis Lollipop case is how Richard Kuklinski got the moniker of Iceman. Not just because of the fact that he was a callous and cold-hearted killer, but also because he put a guy in a fridge and turned him into a cornetto. With all of these bodies stacking up around the vicinity of an already suspect Kuklinski, it's no surprise that eventually the New Jersey State Police would start locking in on him. Led by one Pat Kane, a task force was established with the express purpose of piecing the narrative together and catching our man of interest, Richard Kuklinski. Creatively named Operation Iceman, it managed to uncover a lot of the details that I've already went over by working with the ATF. Why the fuck is the ATF working on this case? Well, mainly the fact that Richard was a prolific gun dealer. And I barely touched upon that until now because fuck me, it'd be easier to list what he didn't sell. Regardless, the ATF embedded one of their satanic secret agents, one Dominic Polifrone, in the Thieves Guild to keep tabs on Richard and collect as much dirt as physically possible. Over the course of 18 months, he would go on to befriend Richard with the help of one Phil Solomon, an actual friend of Kuklinski's. And it was through Polifrone and Solomon that we learned of Richard's penchant for cyanide, including the revelation that Richard tried to offal Daniel Deppner with a fucking burger. Yeah, he tried the burger trick again by letting himself into the apartment at 2 in the morning and going, hey, eat this burger real quick. Like, he actually tried to do that shit again. As well as confirmation that indeed he was selling firearms, as Polifrone partook in the free market by buying a handgun off of Richard. With gritted teeth, I'd assume, because, you know, ATF and all that. Polifrone, who for context adopted the identity of big man mafioso Dominic Provenzano, collated a wide library of recordings that he captured from his talks with Kuklinski. Including the aforementioned burger, he also managed to get a hold of confirmation that Masg was put in a freezer for 2 years by Richard. Of course, seeing as this is a federal agency that we're talking about, they were naturally trying to nudge Richard into incriminating himself even further. Like, encouraging him to perform hits. Including Polifrone supposedly expressing a desire to hire Kuklinski to off a wealthy Jewish cocaine dealer. And no, that's not me being edgy, it's literally the words that Polifrone used to describe the hypothetical hit. And without missing a beat, Kuklinski supposedly went into great detail about how he would perform the deed whilst unknowingly being recorded. One blunder amongst many. The killing blow came when Kuklinski inquired to Paulie about the acquisition of his precious cyanide for a job on an undercover cop. Paulie, an undercover cop, retorted by getting him his cyanide. But not really. It was functionally fake cyanide. But upon getting the goods, Kuklinski went to go and test the powder by fucking once again lacing a burger with it and feeding it to a dog. He was once again very, very annoyed to figure out that the cyanide didn't work. And correctly finding this suspicious and not his own cock-up, he reneged on the job and went home. Of course, by this point, you would have surely just given up with poison altogether. Also, this is the one time that the ATF actually failed to kill a dog. But it wouldn't have made much difference in the end, because just a couple of hours later, after once again failing to poison a living being, Richard was arrested at a roadblock on his way home. Fun fact, Kuklinski's wife was also arrested for being a loud Italian woman, hollering about how Richard Kuklinski was a good boy who didn't do nothing. Also, she was later charged with the illegal possession of a firearm because Richard had a gat stashed in his car that she was a passenger in at the time, because fuck you, we're the ATF. So, how fucked was Richard Kuklinski? Well, he was charged with 5 counts of murder, 6 illegal weapons violations, 3 counts of robbery, and 1 count of attempted murder and attempted robbery, respectively. That is to say, Richard is being charged with the sum total rap sheet of a career criminal or US congressman in one single trial. And with the mountain of proof, including but not limited to hours of audio recordings and, as we'll get into, multiple witnesses, it's fairly safe to say that Richard won't be slithering out of this hole. He was held on a bail bond worth $2 million, and he had to give up his passport. Not that it meant much, because Richard didn't seem like the type of guy to leave Jersey, let alone the country. Upon the press getting a hold of him, all he could muster was, "This is unwarranted, unnecessary. These guys watch too many movies." Because, as we all know, murderers only exist in movies. And I'm happy to report that there is video footage of his arrest happening, and that it sort of evokes tones of a succulent Chinese meal.
This is unwarranted, unnecessary. These guys watch too many movies.
So, who the hell are these witnesses that were being brought in to tout on our dearest Dick? Well, it was none other than Barbara Deppner, the wife of Daniel and someone that Richard actually planned to kill, Percy House, the undercover informant, and of course our dearest Polifrone, the Rat, who also chimed in with a statement of his own. And needless to say, none of them had particularly glowing words to say about Richard. Neil Frank, the public defender assigned to represent Richard, tried to argue that he had no history of violence and that he only had a tough image in front of his peers, like Polifrone, and that there is no evidence to show that Richie Kuklinski was ever assaultive or violent in any way. Basically, his public defender called Kuklinski a larper bitch that wasn't really a big man but made himself look like one to fit in with his co-workers, whilst actually being as sweet as a sugar plum. A daring gambit, to say the least. Even more so, considering that the defence tried to argue that it was, as a matter of fact, Daniel Deppner who masterminded and performed the hit on Gary Smith. And very conveniently, Deppner died of yucky burger disease, so he couldn't argue against this. And as for Barbara and House, well, they were totally unreliable because they lied to law enforcement. House even got immunity from the prosecution, so how could you trust him? So, to the surprise of absolutely no one, the jury found Richard Kuklinski guilty for the murders of Smith and Deppner. However, things got complicated because the deaths were not proven to be by Kuklinski's conduct. What the fuck does that mean? Well, I think that it meant that even though we know that Kuklinski killed them, or was at the very least very heavily involved, we don't know if he personally did it. Same difference, but not really, as this somehow allowed Richard to dodge the death penalty, instead being given a light sentence of 60 years, meaning he would be able to get out of prison at the ripe young age of 111 years old. Thus we see Richard Kuklinski getting whisked off in chains to the highly acclaimed bed and breakfast of the New Jersey State Prison, where he can spend his multiple life sentences milling around, eating white people food, and trying to avoid getting lobbed off by his mafia friends. However, it wasn't until after he was convicted and sitting in a prison that Richard decided to also confess about his shenanigans with Maliband and Masg.
I shot George Malaban 5 times. Louis Masg on July 1st, 1981. I shot him once in the back of the head.
And for that, his sentence got made a little smidge worse, with 2 additional life sentences being put on him. Then he spilled the beans about killing Hoffman. The court decided to not bother sentencing him for this at first because there was not much evidence to use, and frankly, why even bother? It's not like an additional life sentence would really even matter at this point. It was at this point now that Richard started giving out interviews, whether that be to shrinks, spooks, or any other such personalities longing for a scoop from the resident Iceman. And it was here that we get our best insight into Kuklinski via the HBO series on him known as the Iceman tapes. But why do these interviews? Well, according to Richard's daughter, he was convinced to do them by his wife Barbara, as supposedly it would be a good source of income for the now fatherless family. And for all the shit I've rightfully given Richard Kuklinski, he did evidently and sincerely care about his family. So this somewhat tracks. Thing is though, throughout these interviews, Kuklinski had this very nasty habit of exaggerating or just making things up, including claiming even more victims to the point that it was getting rather absurd. He claimed he had killed over 200 people, that since the age of 16 he had been honing his craft of killing by practicing on homeless people Bateman style, and that generally any sort of semi-noteworthy disappearance during his reign was actually totally him, including but not limited to such beaux as Roy DeMeo, the Gambino that headed his own dark brotherhood and disappeared, presumed dead, after catching the eye of the FBI. Yet Richard supposedly done him in after totally mentoring under him Darth Sidious style, even though everyone involved with the DeMeo crew have stated that none of them had even met Richard. Even fucking Jimmy Hoffa, you know, the crooked union president who also disappeared and is presumed dead. I mean, he's definitely fucking dead. But yeah, Kuklinski claimed that he was part of a 4-man team whose sole job was to bag, tag and bury him in Detroit. Then instead of just dumping the body in Detroit, they instead supposedly dragged it all the way out to Jersey so that Kuklinski could play with barrels again. Nobody believed him then, and I sure as fuck don't now. Kuklinski talked some amount of shite. The question is though, why lie? Wouldn't that just invite even more sentences to be slapped onto you and make your chances of ever seeing your children again even more astronomically small? Well, it's quite obvious. If you big up the legend of the Iceman, that means more interviews, more attention, and more money, which you can then give to your family. Because again, as scummy as Richard was, he genuinely was a caring and providing, if absent father, to his children. And if it meant lying through his teeth about killing people for attention, then so be it. But of course, he wasn't expecting to see his kids again until 2042. And sadly for him, he couldn't hold out for that long. Going into prison in his early 50s, it wasn't too long before health complications started to arise. In this case, ironically, Kawasaki disease, which usually only affects toddlers. After being transferred to the secure wing at St. Francis Medical Centre, Richard Kuklinski, the Iceman, passed away on the 5th of March 2006 at the age of 70. Things do get a little bit messy, however, because a week before his passing, his wife Barbara signed a do not resuscitate order, despite the fact that Richard had multiple times verbally said that he would like to be revived if he needed it. I guess Richard just outlived his usefulness. Oh, also, he was very abusive to Barbara, by the way. Yeah, no shit, like, he did genuinely care about his children, but from what I've read, he wasn't exactly chivalrous towards his wife. Like father, like son and all that. So, it looks like Barbara got the last laugh in the end. And there we have it, the story of the Iceman. There's not really much to say here, to be quite honest. You know, he somehow defied the odds and not only had a long and fulfilling life, despite being a fucking hitman, but he also managed to evade detection for 40 odd years, whilst being one of the most comically shit hitmen ever recorded. Granted, that's just based off of what we know he did. There's every possibility that he was actually a hyper-lethal super trooper, but seeing as he kept fucking up with literal cyanide, which some would argue would be the easiest way to kill someone over and over again, one can only assume. But despite him actually being quite a shit hitman and not actually even killing that many people, he still earned the moniker of the Iceman, which is a name practically everyone has heard of, making him one of the most famous hitmen in the world, to the point where he even has his own fucking movie about his life and multiple pop culture references. Despite the fact that his most famous murder was him fucking up trying to kill someone with a burger.
It's Count Dankula on YouTube. Everybody just subscribe.